afternoon, everyone. My name is Akwasi Olusubepa. I'm a senior fellow here at the college and chair of the governing board. It is my pleasure to welcome you to a very special edition of the Massey Dialogues today. Former Minister of Finance, Bill Morneau, in conversation with junior fellows. Before I pass things over to my colleague, Michael Valpy, I would like to acknowledge that Massey College is built on land where many Indigenous peoples have lived, on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee peoples. I'd also like to acknowledge our duty of stewardship towards this land and the great privilege we have to work and to live on these lands. My colleague will be moderating today, Michael Valpy. Michael is a senior fellow here at Massey College as well as at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He teaches in the Book and Media Studies program at the University of St. Michael's College. He's the former deputy managing editor, foreign correspondent, national political columnist, and member of the editorial board of the Globe and Mail. You had a lot of titles there, Michael. Thanks for tripping me up. He was the 2011-2012 CanWest Global Fellow in Media at the University of Western Ontario and was awarded the Toronto Star's 2012-2013 Atkinson Fellowship in Public Policy. Michael, I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thank you, Kwasi, and I'm so glad to see so many of you here filling the chairs. Our format today is primarily a conversation, as Kwasi said, with three of Massey's junior fellows, all doctoral students, and with our special guest. And I'm going to start off by introducing them. And following the conversation, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A with you. And I think with the audience, no, it'll be with you. It won't be with the on-air audience. Our student junior fellows are Alexandra Martin, who's a PhD student in the Department of Political Science, whose research is focused on the development of a genealogy of, quotes, explainability in the governance of AI systems in the Euro-Atlantic context. Professionally, she serves as a policy analyst with the federal government's Artificial Intelligence Hub, where she has supported citizen deliberations on AI ethics and participated in negotiations for the formation of the Global Partnership on AI, an initiative of the G7 and OECD. Erina Moon is pursuing a PhD in information with a previous background in economics. She is interested in how we can use computational methods in the public sector for social change, and is particularly interested in the use of algorithms in child welfare. Originally from Korea, Erina has lived abroad in several countries for a long time, although she still calls Korea her home. And outside of... No. Sorry. We're a bit clumsy here, and I just realized I was going to make a mistake. She is particularly interested in how algorithmic decisions-making models are designed and implemented to mitigate structural inequalities with child welfare on the unhoused domain in North America. Prior to her PhD, she received a Master of Information from the University of Toronto, a BA in Economics from the University of Chicago, and worked in finance and education. Tommaso Alba is an international PhD student from Italy, about to complete his doctorate in economics. He has a background in economics and commerce, and his research revolves around the impact of patent trade and enforcement on the innovative performance of firms, including topics such as anti-competitive ethics of abuse of abusive patent litigation, startup acquisitions, and patent trolls. And while Mr. Morneau and I were speaking just at the back of the room prior to us coming up here, I asked him how much he knew about patent trolls, and he replied by saying, "I'm learning right now." And so I know, Mr. Morneau, that you've undoubtedly been interviewed by many economists, but I'm pretty sure being interviewed by an economist with an expertise in patent trolls is a first for you.
It's absolutely a new thing.
And what is also a first for you, and a first for us, is to have a Massey dialogue with someone who's appeared on the bestseller book list with the Playboy magazine Playmate, Pamela Anderson.
I wasn't aware of that, but thank you for... It's a new thing. I'm not sure I'm going to use that one.
I'm a journalist, I checked, yes.
I think Prince Harry was on at the same time, so... Yeah.
Which brings me to your introduction, finally. Mr. Morneau served as Canada's 39th Minister of Finance from 2015 to 2020. He was also governor of the International Monetary Fund.
A governor.
A governor.
It would have been really busy to be the governor at the same time.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
And the World Bank. Between 1990 and 2015, Mr. Morneau led the multinational human resources firm LifeWorks, which is formerly Morneau Chappell. In 2021, he was Senior Fellow at the Jackson Institute at Yale University. Mr. Morneau currently serves as Chairman of Nova Scotia Power Services, a Director at CIBC, and at Clairvest, Chair of the Advisory Board of Magnet and Senior Advisor at BCG. In January 2023, he released his book, his memoir, Where to From Here, outlining his views on how Canadian economic policy can increase prosperity. Mr. Morneau founded a school for Somali and Sudanese girls in a UN refugee camp in northern Kenya, and is currently sponsoring a scholarship program for young women refugees at the University of Toronto. He's past chair of St. Michael's Hospital, of Covenant House, and C.D. Howe Institute. He holds a Master of Science from the London School of Economics, an MBA from INSEAD, and a BA from Western University. So if you'll join me in welcoming, it's wonderful to have you. And you may not have met Pamela Anderson or a patent troll for that matter, but you must have thoughts about your future, and every time that you have a public event, somebody, I'm sure, asks you what your political future is. So I'm going to start with that.
Okay.
And it's going to be a two-part question. What is your political future, and why do you think it might be in politics?
Well, you're presuming the answer by asking the second part of the question. From my perspective, it was an enormous privilege to be Minister of Finance. An opportunity to serve your country, few people get. I had the particular and unique situation that I went directly from being in private life into being Minister of Finance, which meant there was a steep learning curve, but it also meant that I was able to bring a background from business into that role, which was helpful in some ways and wasn't helpful in other ways. Government and business are quite different. I would say, in future, what I'd like most to do is to fuse those two experiences and try my best to be engaged in thinking about how we can encourage growth in the country. I worry that the level of growth we have in Canada, and we're not unique, the Western industrialized countries face significant challenges in terms of their growth rates, but we are unique in terms of our population growth and our growth rates causing us to be in a particularly challenging space. So that's what I'd really like to be focused on. And so how I do that, I'm hoping to do it in the private sector. I'm hoping to be part of efforts with other Canadians to think about new institutions, new ways we can approach growing the economy. And I don't have, just to preempt the second part of your question, I don't have any aspirations to run for office again. I would never say never. You always want to be available to serve your country if what you can bring to the table might provide opportunity for advantage. But I don't presume that that opportunity is necessarily going to come, Michael.
What talent do you have that a political leader requires? I mean, you're from a wealthy family. If you don't mind me pointing this out, you're married to a wealthy woman. Do you feel that you understand the stresses on most Canadians? Do you understand what they're going through? And how have you acquired that understanding?
Well, I wouldn't say that those aspects of my background are talents. There's obviously good fortune in my background, and I recognize that that's different than a large majority of Canadians. What I tried to do in my time in office was to listen to people coming from all different perspectives, to do my best to not only, hi Mohammed, nice to see you, not only to do it in...
He just said he's going to run for Prime Minister.
Yeah, you missed that one, sure, yeah. Support that. Not only in my role as Minister of Finance, because obviously your part of your job in coming up with policy alternatives is to try to understand different perspectives, but also my role as a Member of Parliament. I represented people in a very diverse riding, Toronto Centre. I had had some exposure to that riding, having been involved at St. Michael's Hospital, which was in the riding, and Covenant House was in the riding. So exposure to people that came from very challenged situations in both those institutions. So, look, I won't claim that I understand what other people are going through. I don't think you can ever put yourself completely in someone else's shoes. I certainly tried and continue to try, both in my private life and my life in whatever I'm trying to do, to understand other people's perspectives. And I won't claim it's a talent, but I'm doing my best at it.
I'm going to put you into Tommaso's
Hands.
So unfortunately, I think
You're not going to ask me about patent
it's not
trolls?
going to be patent trolls. And so I'll ask something more technical. So first, I have to thank you, because it was very interesting for me to read your book, because I moved to Canada 1 year after you took office. So for me, reading your book was re-seeing the last 6-7 years, but instead of from the eyes of an immigrant, from the eye of a policymaker, and it was very entertaining. And a theme in your book that ties with what you just said is your concern for a stagnant productivity in Canada. And we usually think of it as GDP per hour, like that's worker productivity. And a recurrent topic is your clash between this concern of yours and the focus of the government in which you served. That was mostly on still important, but redistributive aspects more than long-term growth.
Right.
Now, the markers, the intermediate stepping stones that lead to growth are generally recognized. We want investment, both private or public, foreign or retaining domestic investment. We want high-skilled workers. So we can have that with education. We can have by attracting immigrants, high-skilled immigrants, or innovation. And to achieve that, you propose some strategy in the book, and some of which you acted upon. For example, like investment in infrastructure is a typical textbook way to incentivize public and private joint ventures, and the multiplicative effect and attract other investment out of that. And you acted on that like signing the act of creating this Canadian infrastructure bank. And also you mentioned several times some tax strategy to try to attract and retain and especially extend the tax advantage of small businesses so that they can grow. Right. So this is a very long premise to come to the actual question. That is, in this, since a recurrent argument is that you find your objective clashing with the previous government, I would like you, if you wish, to share what kind of policies you wanted to enact and you couldn't, and if you can talk about the type of resistance you found. And second, whether all the policies that you have in mind are focused on the capital aspect of the equation I implicitly mentioned, or you also you have some policies that I don't think I much covered in the book on the human capital and on the innovation side, or in particular if you have any IP strategies to...
You're back to patent trolls again. Right?
No,
Okay,
I brought that.
I knew we were going to get there. Yeah.
But it is true that it is a concern that Canadian-formed talent and Canadian-formed ideas often flow to your neighboring US.
Right.
And it's a concern that, that my own country has. We call it the fuga dei cervelli, the escape of brains. So yeah. I would really much enjoy to hear your proposed solution.
That's a big question. So, well, let me start by framing what I was trying to say in my book. And so I wasn't trying to talk about a clash between me and the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office as the fundamental challenge that we're facing. I see the government, the current government, as having done some really important things that are going to be very positive for the long term. And I identify a few of those. You know, the Canada Child Benefit, I think, is a very solid public policy that I don't think will go away, because the way we did it was by taking a universal program, shrinking it down and giving more money to a smaller group of constituents, which means that the next government can't take it away because those constituents are dependent on it, and they can't make it universal again because it's just too expensive. So I think, that's a good example of, I think, really good public policy. I think the introduction of the expansion of the Canada Pension Plan is really excellent public policy for long-term, especially low and middle-income Canadians, who will be much better off. I think, the carbon pricing decision was fundamental to our approach to dealing with climate change. I think, increasing immigration, an excellent future-based policy that I think is going to make great long-term difference. So we didn't have differences of opinion on most of those. I think what I'm focused on is the fact that government today, with the challenges that we face, the intense media cycle, the social media, which is, frankly, pretty new. The reality of the day-to-day stresses in government mean it's very hard to focus on those long-term things. So yes, we did do some of the things that you mentioned, the Canada Infrastructure Bank as a good example, but it's hard to actually take the long-term decisions that have, short-term peril, political peril, in the context of that really intense media cycle. It's just harder to do that. So I'm really identifying what I see as some of those significant long-term challenges that this government and future governments will face in an era that's much more rapid fire, because of the nature of the environment that we're in. So that's the fundamental difference that I want to point out, the difference in what a government can do today versus what they could do yesterday. And to start a dialogue on how do we address that? If there's things that we can't get done today that we might have been able to get done yesterday. Think about the making the central bank independent that we did a couple generations ago. That was a really great long-term decision, I think, for us, creating more stability in our economy over the long term. And taking those sort of institutional changes today would be hard, but they might actually make a difference if we found ways to depoliticize decisions that are long-term in nature. And I talk about housing in the book as a good example. So I think that's the fundamental thing I'm trying to ask Canadians about in the face of growth rates that are not strong enough. And it's worth putting the numbers out there, because the analogy I use in the book is a frog boiling in the pot. I mean, when things happen slowly, you don't always notice it. But we are expected to grow over the next 40 years, according to the OECD, at about real terms 30%. So 30% over 40 years, when you have population growth of 1% a year. I think all of you three beside me are really good at math. That math isn't very good. Per capita incomes don't go up on a real basis. And that means that the promise that we had from my parents' generation, my generation, the next generation, that next generations were going to be better off, that's not going to be true. It's mathematically not going to be true unless we do something different. And that's That's what I want to spark. So, you know, I hope some people pick up the book and take that away from it. That's really the discussion I want to spark. It means that governments need to make choices. They need to make choices on where they spend. You can't spend everywhere. They need to make choices on, you know, how they expend their efforts, whether it's on infrastructure projects that we can actually put money into, whether it's on, you know, creating IP rules that are going to help us here, whether it's investing at the front end at science and technology. I mean, I always like the idea of investing in creating the ecosystem as opposed to the, you know, the particular investments that come much later in the cycle. So those are some of the debates we had. I wouldn't say there were clashes, but there's always those debates. And I would like to think that most of our debates were naturally me as Minister of Finance, Department of Finance, focusing on those long-term economic drivers, and naturally the center of government having to deal with the day-to-day political realities. So that creates tension, as it should. And you know, we just need to recognize that and think about what are we going to do to deal with it in the future.
So you conclude your book with a call, I mean, a suggestion to found an independent board that could put together like the federal finance minister and finance minister from the provinces, plus an independent consultant to try to pursue, to try to disentangle that political cycle from the economic cycle. That is the problem you were finding, if I understand reading you correctly. And suppose now the board is founded and you're the head of it. What would be your first move? What would be what are the ideal policy, the hard policies that were unfeasible or untasteful?
No, we get it. Yeah.
When you were in
you know,
office.
First, you know, the idea that I put forth in the book, it's not a unique Bill Morneau idea. As I put out there, many countries have decided to put in place some sort of growth commission. I don't necessarily know that I have the best ideas on how it should be formed, but my view is that at minimum, if we're going to think about how we grow the economy, we need to bring together the provincial governments, as well as the federal government and the private sector together. Because I think one of my clear observations based on my time is that, you know, business people don't really understand government, and government doesn't really understand what goes on in business. And why wouldn't that be obvious to us? Because if you're you know, spending all of your time in one part of the economy, you're not necessarily going to fully appreciate what goes on. So that the iterative nature of developing policy, I think, between those actors is going to be important. And I bring the provinces into it because I think a lot of the things that we need to deal with in Canada are going to be Fed-Prov, and they're going to need driving intent from the private sector as well. So if you think about the first things you want to do, I mean, obviously there's some low-hanging fruit. The federal provincial barriers in this country don't make a lot of sense. And we think of the barriers, you know, we read about, you know, liquor going across borders. It's not stuff like that. It's the fact that, you know, if you're licensed in one province, you need to get licensed in another province. We don't have even labor mobility in this country. Your ability to move goods across the country is impeded because of, you know, rules around trucking between provinces. There's things that we can deal with that are creating barriers. So there's low-hanging fruit. The IMF comes to Canada each year to do an assessment of how we could improve our economy. Their assessment is a 4% increase in GDP if we're able to deal appropriately with those interprovincial barriers. I'm not sure whether that number is necessarily correct. It's an estimate, but the point and the direction is clear. There's some low-hanging fruit here that we can deal with. The harder stuff is going to be thinking about, you know, how do we deal with regulatory processes in this country that are creating barriers to investment. And, you know, we have a legitimate need to have regulatory processes that are inclusive, that bring Indigenous people into discussions. That's critically important, and the Supreme Court has reinforced that. But we need to benchmark that against the need to also be part of the clean energy supply chain. So if we want to really be people that are part of that supply chain, we're going to need to do things as fast as other countries are doing. So we're going to need to think, how do we do that? How do we accelerate a process that remains inclusive? So that would be a critical issue that I'd want us to face up to think about how we realize investment. And then, you know, as we think about places like the Canada Infrastructure Bank, what we hoped was that we would find ways to create a flywheel of renewed investment in things by taking some things out of the government sector if they don't need to be there. So there's ideas like that that are really hard politically, but that I think most Canadians might buy into if they saw that it's actually going to increase prosperity. So what's clear is I don't have all the answers, and that's the point. The point is that these actors need to work together to get to the ideas that are both going to have the biggest impact and the greatest likelihood of implementation. And the discussion has to start with, we know we need to grow, how are we going to do it? And I would say that the government I was part of did a great job on creating some really important foundational things that we need to do. You know, as I mentioned, CPP, Canada Child Benefit, carbon price. But I think thinking about growth was not necessarily second nature.
Thank you.
Erina?
So I'm a little newer to Canada than Tommaso. My question sort of looks back to your tenure as finance minister and then also forward into Canada's future. So in your book, in your interviews, you mentioned during your time in government, you made a lot of meaningful change, introducing the Canadian child benefit, uplifting the quality of life for low and middle class families. You also introduced a price on carbon, which is really important for climate change. And then another theme that resonated in the book was that over time, and especially during the height of COVID, that you found you were quite frustrated with the PMO, the Prime Minister and advisors, when they were focusing on the short-term, more popular goals than considering the long-term fiscal sort of integrity of the measures. And what I'm curious is your take on the current economic challenges we're facing today. So I'm sort of new to Canada. I know when I'm buying snacks, they're a lot more expensive than they were last year. I'm spending a lot more. Rents have gone up a lot. And there's a lot of discussion around the haves and have-nots. You know, landlords owning a lot, generating a lot of income from rents. Renters, they're suffering because they're facing higher rents. Landlords, on the other hand, aren't that happy. Their mortgage rates are going up, so they're offsetting their costs to renters and so on. So we're seeing housing crises in major cities. Homelessness numbers are going up around Canada. So what I'm really interested is, do you think what we're seeing right now is an after effect of the COVID relief measures that we saw? Or is this a long-term effect of the historically low interest rates that we had since the 2008 financial crisis? And do you think, when looking back as finance minister, did you think there was more things that you could have done? Was there sufficient planning that you could have done to account for this kind of scenario where we no longer have near zero interest rates and we're in a new world right now? Yeah.
So again, great question, and there's lots to talk about there. First, I think I'd like to make clear, my sense is that what the Canadian government did when COVID appeared in Canada was, largely correct. I mean, we had a problem where an overwhelming number of people, couldn't pay rent, couldn't buy groceries, and there was, I don't think, any response that was reasonable other than to support people massively against that challenge. And similarly, we wanted an economy when we came out of the crisis, so supporting businesses made sense. So there was not a difference of opinion in the need for that massive support. Of course, there's always going to be a friction and a tension between a finance minister and the people who are focused on the shorter term politics against the quantum of spending. So yes, we had those tensions and frictions. And I look back on them and say they're entirely appropriate and to be expected. I would want to see any finance minister have those sort of tensions with the Prime Minister, because otherwise you don't get to good outcomes. 5 years being finance minister, from my standpoint, that's a pretty long time. And I think we had lots of periods where there was overwhelming agreement and some challenging periods where we didn't always agree, and that's as it should be. So I don't want to say that the government missed it. I do think that in a few economies, the answer is probably yes, that we over-invested in COVID, both at the time and for a longer time period than was necessary. And Canada is not the only country that had that situation. Certainly the United States, for different reasons, also had that situation. So I'm pretty sure economists, and you folks are some of them, would agree that there's some element of hangover as a result of that. It's just, that's what happens. But I don't think that you can draw a line from that to most of the things that you're talking about. I mean, it's happening at the same time as there's some clear change in supply chains. We had those supply chain constraints. Now we have a lot of concerns around China that are causing deglobalization, at least, in many cases, redundant supply chains that are, by definition, inflationary. I mean, that's the reality of what's going on. So we can't just identify one particular situation that's driving that. I do think that some of those, they continue to have some kind of inflationary impact. That's obvious. Now, whether that will be enough to change the deflationary things that we've seen over time, including aging of the population, and I do think globalization is unlikely to decelerate as fast as people think. I mean, certainly de-linking between China and the West, yes, but that's not the only pattern that we're going to see. So, could we have done more in appreciating that interest rates were certainly going to go up? During the time I was there, we worked hard to try to deal with some of the ramifications. We got Toronto, Vancouver, and Ontario and BC together to think about housing challenges, which were obviously result, to a great extent from low interest rates, and also from our immigration policies. So those challenges we couldn't and wouldn't have wanted to deal with the immigration. So we were trying to deal with making sure that we had the right approaches to trying to deal with increased housing density in our major cities that were experiencing the worst of those challenges. Could we do better? Absolutely. And it's hard. It's a hard place to do better against. So on many policies, I look back and say, yeah, you can do it. If you had a do-over, you'd do it differently. But I think what we need to do now, rather than worry about what happened in the past, is think about how do we accelerate those discussions now? How do we encourage more density in our cities that deals with the real housing challenge that we have? How do we deal with the issue around inflation in a way that's not going to be itself inflationary? So the government's trying its best to toe a line on wage increases, recognizing that it's fair to give people wage increases in today's environment. I mean, they've experienced, as you have, higher prices. On the other hand, we don't want to cause the very problem that we're dealing with. So I think it's going to be hard, and I think we should expect and be careful around wage expectations, because they're going to be higher as anyone would take that approach given their situation. So.
If any of you want to jump in and ask a follow-up question, feel free to. And if there's no insistence on that, let me go to Alex. I'm sorry, Erina, do you have a...
No, I'm good for now, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, if no one's going to go then. Well, you previously indicated, and I think this has come across in several of the questions that have already come up, that you felt that Trudeau and the Prime Minister's office became overly preoccupied with what they perceived and how they were perceived at the expense of good policy. And it seems that what you're critiquing Trudeau and his advisors of engaging in is a type of political representation where elected officials prioritize what they'll be rewarded for in the next election or their perceptions, rather than sticking to the type of representative behavior you described in the post-2015 election period that prioritizes actioning political promises from the platform commitments. However, both of these approaches have been critiqued by academics concerned with the rising polarization and the qualities of our democracy. And in particular, they argue that these limit the role of ordinary citizens to passive consumers of political messaging who only really emerge as political actors when it comes time to enter the voting booth. So what do you understand to be the appropriate role for public opinion in shaping policy, and what role does the average citizen, not as stakeholders, experts, or the media, play in your account of good political leadership?
Okay.
It's an interesting and challenging question. I am, as you identify in the book, very biased to the view that it is good public policy for a government to say what they intend to do as best they can at the time of an election period, and work to follow through against those promises. You know, it's not always the case that you can follow through on them exactly the way that you identified, but I think that creates confidence and trust in government if you, to the best of your abilities, do what you say you're going to do. And you know, obviously those intents get hit by reality the day after you're elected, so you can't predict what happens. And in some cases, the economy may preclude you from doing some of the things that you want to do, so you can't always achieve what you wanted to achieve. But I think aspiring to do that is at least from where I sit, something it's really important for trust and for confidence, which I think we can probably agree on that as being a real challenge, that the level of trust in government is declining. So that would be my bias, as opposed to, you know, obviously being more cavalier in how you do it. In terms of, you know, how you then refresh and renew your thinking over time and how you bring people into that discussion, you know, it's difficult to do. I'll acknowledge that it's difficult to do. You're hopeful that you get feedback through your system, through your members of parliament who are out listening to constituents and bringing that information back to government. You're hopeful that the actual process of the debate in parliament brings issues to the fore, and that public sentiment drives you in ways that are positive through that process. And I think that does, that feedback loop does happen, whether you think from your studies that it happens effectively enough. That'd be a second question. But I think it's also incumbent on us thinking about, as I said at the outset, you know, new institutional ways to bring insights in. You know, our example was that we had a fulsome idea of what we wanted to achieve before we got in 2015. We had a majority, so we had a mandate to go about trying to achieve those goals. And I think to complement the government where I think it should be complemented, many of those objectives, not all, but many of those objectives were actioned on, and the policy was implemented. So I think that helps in terms of building trust. Where it starts getting more difficult is when, you know, the real world of governing starts forcing you to think about how much time do you have to do the things you want to do, and you're going to have to deal with other things. You know, we didn't expect to have Donald Trump become president and have to renegotiate NAFTA. So that took a lot of time that was not on our agenda to do. And so that, as I identify in the book, I thought the Prime Minister was extremely effective in maintaining a strong relationship between our government and the various players in the United States through that process. So you have to pivot, and that takes time away from doing other things naturally. I think one of the challenges is recognizing that, and this comes with being mature as a government, recognizing that you are going to have those issues, and therefore you need to build the capacity to continue doing what you were doing even at the time where other things come and seemingly make it difficult to stay on your agenda. So I don't know if I've adequately answered your question, but I think you get my bias.
No, it's fantastic. And I actually wanted to also go back to a bit of a theme that came up in one of your earlier answers, but you've also been quoted as saying that we need to look at other opportunities to decouple policy from politics, and have spoken more generally about how the country would benefit from depoliticizing some of the important public policy decisions, and you've already referenced the Bank of Canada as being a previous good example of that. But you've also specifically used reference to a nonpartisan expert advisory council on growth that you had as an example of positive potential that was thwarted due to politicization of the recommendations. However, I think it'd be inaccurate to characterize policy proposals of any sort as non-political. And policy always privileges certain goals or understandings of just outcomes, and no policy tool exists devoid of the political paradigm that legitimates it as an accurate solution to the problem at hand. So with this being said, how do you respond to critics that your vision for a better government in Canada is more technocratic than democratic in nature? And should we be working to depoliticize public policy, or is the focus perhaps more on improving the quality of public discourse around our policies?
First of all, I think it's a fair criticism that that what I'm advocating certainly appears to be more technocratic than democratic. But what I'm actually hoping that we would do is have a better way of getting what would be called the technocratic solutions to be available for the legitimate democracy of the day. So what I'm arguing for is some form of body that would be charged with thinking about policies that could unleash a greater level of productivity and growth, and do that in such a way that was not naive to the inevitable politics that are going to come out later. So thinking about the matrix of biggest impact and most likely to be able to be implemented, and putting those policies out in such a way that the government of the day, irrespective of whether it's government on the right or the left, has the ability to look at this and say, okay, I can see that a group of people with insights into how we can best make achievements has come up with these policy ideas, and they can then take them off the shelf. And I'm not arguing that it should necessarily be technocratic, because I think that you would need, as I said, to have provincial actors engaged as well as federal actors. And by definition, those are going to be political actors from the provinces, from one side or the other. And I'm not arguing that it should be people that have no current affiliation with politics. So I'm just trying to think of a process that gets us to conclusions that we can agree are reasonable things that would enhance our growth, and leave the government of the day to choose. And you can't dictate, and nor do we want to dictate what the government can do. But I'm just arguing that you come up with a potentially richer stream of policy ideas that are going to have more potential for implementation if they've already been pre-vetted by a federal, provincial, private, public group of people who have the capacity to do the analysis and get to the conclusions that might have the biggest impact.
You touched on a really important, sorry, do you want to go ahead?
I
Yes,
was
go
actually
ahead.
just going to quickly follow up, because I think that it's interesting, because a lot of the description you provide I'm sympathetic to, but it does remind me a lot of the intended job description for policy analysts, or what the actual bureaucratic infrastructure is supposed to be able to support ministers' offices to be able to do. Where do you think perhaps that there are institutional features within our current federal bureaucracy where it either limits our ability to actually do that, or it's something that can be a spot for improvement?
I wouldn't want this idea, and by the way, I'm not really, I would say that I'm more interested in the outcome that I'm looking towards, which is policies that are focused on growth. And so the actual institutional approach is less my concern that the actual impact is achieved. My observation of the current bureaucratic process is that we do get good ideas that come up, that we don't have at the political level a good, what I'd call matrix of biggest impact, most likely to get across the finish line, that includes the provincial actors there as well. And so partially it would be a mechanism to try and get buy-in from different places across the country. And the provincial aspect to me is really important, because if I think about healthcare, immigration, infrastructure, taxes, all of these things require Fed-Prov coordination. And I don't see that the Fed-Prov coordination is at the level it needs to be in order to make those things plausible. And that's not a criticism of the provincial government public servants or the federal government public servants. It's just saying that we don't have those institutional ways of making that happen, which you might agree with or not agree with, which is okay.
You came into politics fresh in 2015.
I don't look fresh now? Is that that's the implication?
How many patent trolls do you have?
Yeah.
And my question, have you driven it out of my mind? My question question is, how well did you understand before you took up your seat at the cabinet table the tensions between the technocrats and the politicians? How competent were you to deal with that? Because it seems that what comes out of your book or comes out of your interviews is that you had a different agenda from what the Prime Minister had. The Prime Minister had to deal with the stresses, the public stresses, the political stresses. You had to deal with the expertise from your department. Is that an accurate?
You know, I don't want to, I think it isn't, I don't think it is accurate. I don't want to in any way suggest that the government would not want to ensure that our economy is growing. So that's not what I'm trying to say at all. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's really hard in the reality of governing to keep that on the forefront. It's a big challenge, and that is probably where the two, you know, the Prime Minister's office and my perspective would have been different. So that's okay. That's natural. So I don't think that their intent is any different. It's just their ability to execute is hard. And so I'm just thinking, are there new ways or better ways that we can actually achieve those goals over time? So, and to your question about, you know, how prepared was I? You know, it is absolutely clear that there were lots of gaps in my knowledge when I got into the role in November 2015. I mean, the last time I had been in the Parliament was when I had gone to visit it in early high school. So, you know, I clearly had lots of gaps. So there was much to learn, and I think it's important to be humbled by the challenge. So I was on a steep learning curve then. I found really during my entire time as Minister of Finance, I was on a pretty steep learning curve. And if the criticism of me that I was more focused on getting stuff done and working with the public service than working with the political class, if that's the criticism, I think it's valid. I think it's pretty fair. I mean, I was never the person who had you know, the 20 or 30 years of political experience before. I'd had business experience, which is quite different and helpful in some ways, for sure, but not in others. You know, business and government are different. Very helpful in trying to figure out what the right path is for taxation, because you actually understand how it works in a way that someone who hadn't been exposed could necessarily understand. Very helpful in understanding things like, you know, how to expand the Canada Pension Plan. But, you know, I was talking to Mr. Weisman here about the way we elect people in Canada. Was my expertise in our electoral process something that, you know, added some value? No. I mean, I was a citizen, but I didn't have any particular expertise in that area.
Did the Prime Minister have any choice but to be nice to the people, our fellow Canadians who were suffering as a result of the pandemic? And it almost seems as if you faulted him for being too nice. Is that a fair comment?
I think when you use words like nice, you put a value judgment on something that I would argue is not what I was trying to say. I think the goal was to deal with the challenge and to deal with it in a way that was humane and recognize the challenges people were going through, but didn't leave us spending more than we should spend, because those costs inevitably are going to be borne on somebody, and not create economic challenges as a result that could be real. And so I think I wouldn't want to make too much of the differences. There was, in my estimation, there was some calibration that was perhaps wrong. But as I said, I think the overall approach was correct, especially at the beginning, which was the most challenging time for Canadians.
Just a final quick question, if I can, and then we'll go on to the next part, is what was nice about the job? What did you enjoy about the job as finance minister? Well, we've talked a lot about what the problems were.
So first of all, I loved the job. I mean, I really enjoyed the ability to work with a team of people to try and solve for some challenges that were real and find solutions that that were able to be implemented in a way that people would be able to afford over time. So I'll use it's a fairly technocratic example, but I'll use the Canada Pension Plan expansion. I mean, it'll make a really big long-term difference, especially to lower and middle income Canadians, because it'll go from 25% of their final average earnings to 33%. And together with GIS and OAS, it means a significant percentage of Canadians will be much better off and have the real possibility of retiring in dignity. And it was done with an agreement at the federal provincial level in a way that I think did not put, I mean, of course there was a burden on both individuals and the private sector, but it put that burden over a period of time so that people could adjust. So that was extremely rewarding personally, and I think really good policy for the long term. So that's a particular personal example, but I think there were many others. You know, there were a lot of high fives around when we got the Supreme Court ruling on the carbon price. You know, that was, we think, foundational. It's not done because we don't have carbon markets for the high emitters that work. We're going to have, you know, discordant political or policy approaches between us and the United States that are challenging. So it's not perfect, but I think really big progress. So there are moments of you know, a really rewarding experience, and then there's the hard part. I mean, you know, as you know, politics for politicians can be hard. I mean, there's stories I could tell you that would you know, that would elaborate a bit on that, which maybe we'll do it when the camera's off. But you know, you know that you're going to get bruises and scar tissue, and you have to decide whether it's worth it. And you have to decide every day whether it's worth it. And while I was there, every day I would have said, I want to keep doing this. And then, you know, it came to an end, and that's the way it happens.
Good. Mr. Morneau, that takes care of this part of your session with us, and thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thanks.